So you might well ask, how are Trump's tariffs going? And the answer is, they're not going well at all. And who could have predicted that? Me. Yeah, Trump said they were going to cut the trade deficit, boost manufacturing. We were going to make all this money from it. Not only would the budget be balanced, we'd have so much extra that he could send us all $2,000 checks or whatever it is. Yeah, that's not how it's turning out. And we've got Eric Boehm here in Reason to give us some of the latest numbers on that. And when you're evaluating things like tariffs, it's a good question to ask, what were they supposedly for? You state the goals and then you see how well you meet those goals. Well, Trump celebrated them as a source of government revenue, for example, but also claimed they are meant as a negotiating tactic. They can't be both. Tariffs used for negotiation are meant to be removed once negotiations are complete, rendering them useless for long-term revenue. For Trump, tariffs are a solution to every problem, and the trade war is more about the vibes than the economics. And so he talks about a hearing back in April with the House Ways and Means Committee. Answering Brendan Boyle, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said, "The trade deficit needs to go in the right direction. Manufacturing as a share of GDP needs to go in the right direction." Okay, so we're getting down the trade deficit and we're getting down manufacturing as a share of GDP. Pretty clear. More than 6 months later, neither goal is any closer to being achieved. More importantly, neither seems likely to be completed over the long term by an economic policy rooted in barriers to trade. So we'll start with the trade deficit, and I'll explain what I've explained in a number of videos over the decade plus I've been on YouTube doing this. What is it, like 17, almost 18 years? No, wait, 2007? It'll be 19 years here in a few months that I've been doing this. Wow. But basically, the trade deficit is a dumb term. So what is it? He says, well, it's the difference between the total value of all imports and exports, but how do you value them? If you value them in dollars, then shouldn't they balance out, because that's what exchange rates are for? You import goods from Mexico that are priced in pesos, but that gets exchanged to dollars, and in return, everything we export to Mexico gets exchanged to pesos, and the exchange rate balances that out. So how could there possibly be a difference there? Well, there's only one way, and that's because there's something else that's going on. People are also investing. So they can invest in American companies, they can buy U.S. bonds, things like that. If more Mexicans invest in the United States than Americans invest in Mexico, that means we have a higher net foreign investment. That's what the trade deficit really is, because a greater portion of that is used for investment rather than our exports. So whatever trade-off you think is happening with exports is being made up with investment. We're getting more investment money, and that's a good thing. So the trade deficit is a dumb name, and that's why economists call it net foreign investment, because that's what it is. The trade deficit is a dumb name that they came up with for purely political purposes. And it causes confusion, like he points out here. Trump has been obsessed with the trade deficit for years, though he tends to confuse it with the federal government's budget deficit, the gap between spending and revenue. And Trump's not the only one. You see people doing this all the time, acting like the trade deficit has something to do with the budget deficit. It doesn't. It has nothing to do with that. The budget deficit happens because our government spends more than it takes in. That's all it is. So from January to July of 2025, America's trade deficit was $840 billion, about 23% larger than during the same month in 2024. So it increased the trade deficit. Why would that happen? Well, if you think about what I just said, you'll know why. Americans aren't importing as much. Well, what does that mean? What's happening with net foreign investment? That's the key. You do that, you increase net foreign investment, and you increase the so-called trade deficit. That increase partially reflects businesses' urgency to get goods into the country quickly before even higher tariffs were enacted. It also reflects a now well-established fact. Tariffs don't reduce trade deficits. During his first term, Trump raised various tariffs, but the country's trade deficit climbed from about $481 billion in 2016 to $679 billion in 2020. So yeah, it didn't work. Even by his fake statistic, didn't work. Tariffs are no better as a tool for boosting manufacturing. According to the Commerce Department, manufacturing has contributed 9.4% of total GDP, down from 9.8% in 2024. Rather than being helped, the manufacturing sector is being crushed by tariffs, which are increasing the costs of raw materials and intermediate goods. And if you remember reading iPencil, you think about all the little things that we don't even know about. Oh, we got to get raw materials from other countries. Well, the tariffs apply to those. Okay, we'll get the raw materials from America. Okay, but what about the tools to process them? Do those come from other countries? Do the materials to make those come from other countries? You've got so many things like that it's pretty much impossible to make sure that every last little bit of it comes from America. So it's always going to be harmed by tariffs. Overall manufacturing activity has declined for 7 consecutive months through September. Just 2.1% of business owners believe the tariffs had a positive impact. The effect is most widespread in manufacturing, where more than 70% of firms noted negative impacts. But Boehm also points out that Greer's focus on manufacturing as a share of GDP is a misguided way of looking at the economy. And I've got several videos about the problem with using GDP as a metric of economic health. It wasn't intended to do that. It was intended just as a normalization factor for the statistics. That's all it was for. Simon Kuznets, who invented GDP, specifically said not to use it as a measure for well-being in the economy. He also said not to include government spending. You see what they did. But the main problem here, as he points out, that metric assumes that the whole economy is a fixed size, which is not true. So if you're in a recession or if you're in a period of prosperity, that can go up and down for reasons that have nothing to do with the figure you're looking at, and so your sector might do well or might do less well just because of the way the numbers come out, not because of what's actually going on in that sector. But something else to consider that he doesn't mention. What about knock-on effects of tariffs that end up having a negative effect on GDP? If tariffs have a negative overall effect on the economy, and they do, then GDP overall will decline, so even if manufacturing as a share of GDP goes up, overall GDP going down means that you haven't really helped anything. Some in Trump's orbit insist that 15% of the economy should be manufacturing. That's an arbitrary target. And if the slice of the pie labeled manufacturing should grow, what sectors should shrink to make up for it? Yeah, if manufacturing should be more than 15%, something else has got to lose a certain percent to give it to manufacturing. That's why that's a dumb way of looking at it. Greer added a third goal for the administration's tariff policies, increasing real median household income. But tariffs are making it more difficult for households to make ends meet. An October study from the Harvard Business School shows that retail prices have declined throughout 2024 and early 2025, then began rising in April after Trump's tariffs were announced. Yeah, just go buy groceries and you'll see it. The Trump administration's tariff policies misunderstand the value of trade in a productive, flourishing economy. The administration has set the wrong goals and then made policy choices that are unlikely to achieve them. Yeah, we've known this since David Ricardo and the law of comparative advantage. Countries are always better off with free trade. The only effect tariffs can ever have is harmful. And if you got some sort of bug up your butt about the trade deficit, anything you could possibly do to try and get the trade deficit down will be harmful to the economy. The best way is freedom. And we just go from one to the other, don't we? We had Biden with his terrible economics, which led to Bidenflation. And now Trump with not only the tariffs, but this incredibly disruptive immigration policy. It'll just make things worse. And then doubly so if he sends out those $2,000 checks to everyone, or however much he said they were going to be. What's that going to do? That'll just make Trumpflation instead of Bidenflation. And so the wheel turns. Are you getting the point yet? Those of you who said, well, okay, I'll vote Trump because he's the best way to get us towards a libertarian America. Is that what's happening? Those of you who said that Trump was the lesser of two evils, those of you who said that Trump would at least nudge us in the right direction, those of you who agreed with every other presidential race, that yeah, there's not a lick of difference between them, and what we should really be pushing for is freedom and liberty across the board. Those of you who jumped over to vote for Trump, how you feeling about that now? Are you seeing that there's really no difference? And are you going to be fooled again? Thank you so very much for watching. Comments for the Comment God, shares for the Share Throne. Please like, subscribe, and the bell. And of course, donate.bogosity.tv keeps me doing what I do. Even just tiny little one-time donations. It doesn't have to be regular support, although it can be, and that'll get to these videos early and ad-free, and other benefits as well, so please check all of that out. Thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, stay strong and be free.